Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today's guest, Bonnie Glaser, is a familiar face to Taiwan and China watchers. She's the managing director of the German Marshall Fund Indo-Pacific Program. Now, last year, Bonnie co-authored U.S.-Taiwan Relations with Ryan Haas and Richard Bush. TVBS has translated this book and published it in Taiwan. 步步为营. It's available in bookstores. In light of the presidential and legislative elections 10 days ago, we would like Bonnie to share with us her thoughts. So welcome back to the meeting room, Bonnie.
Thank you so much for having me, Wenqi.
So a lot of people actually don't know how long you've been involved in Taiwan issues. So tell our audience, when did it start?
Well, after I finished my undergraduate studies, I went to Taiwan to study Chinese, and I was there for about a year and a half. I arrived in Taiwan 3 weeks after the United States broke diplomatic ties with Taiwan, so that was 1979. And then after I finished my language studies, I actually didn't go back to Taiwan until 1996, which was when China was flying missiles near Taiwan. And I was doing a small project at that time for the Department of Defense.
We wanted to ask because we really want to show, unlike many recent commentators on Taiwan issues who came to the issue relatively late, you really have been on this issue for such a long time. Shows your credibility and your knowledge and history with Taiwan. So now, fast forward, how would you think about this year's elections? How is it different from the past? Any surprises to you?
Well, first I would say, Wenqi, of course I don't live in Taiwan, and watching Taiwan's elections from afar is likely quite different from watching them up close. From where I sit, there was a lot of similarity with past elections. There was quite a bit of discussion about China, some discussion about domestic challenges and potential policy solutions, but not enough, in my view. The usual rallies took place, as well as a few debates among the presidential and vice presidential candidates. There were scandals revealed, allegations of wrongdoing. The focus on this election, I think, as a stark choice between war and peace, or at least this is the way that KMT framed it, and also Beijing framed it. I think that was a bit different from the past. But I think what was most surprising to me was the interventions by former President Ma Ying-jeou twice, once to try to persuade Hou Yu-ih and Ko Wen-je to join on a single ticket. And then again, a few days before the elections, when he said in an interview with Deutsche Welle that Taiwan has no choice but to trust Xi Jinping. And I think that many people believe that comment and the entire interview may have had an impact on the elections. And that was a bit surprising to me.
So, so those interventions, obviously, Taiwan's elections always never lack for the lack of sort of drama. But that President Ma's interventions, did it look like it had an impact on the election from your point of view?
Well, again, very difficult to tell from all the way here in the United States. But I have heard from people in Taiwan that they believe that it had an impact on the election.
Well, you've been saying, you know, you're watching it from Washington, D.C., and I think the world, as we, you know, have been reading a lot of media reporting, there just seems to be unprecedented press coverage of Taiwan's elections this time. And why do you think that's the case? Like, what's your analysis of this phenomenon?
Well, there's a surge in interest globally in Taiwan. Some of that interest has just been focused on Taiwan's democracy, its key role in semiconductor supply chains, and a great deal of attention, of course, has also been focused on the growing cross-strait tensions and the risk of military conflict. international interest and attention on Taiwan, I think, has on balance been very positive for Taiwan, but it has also had some negative impact. For example, worries about military conflict have generated some concern in the business community. I recall reading recently that FDI was down about 15% in 2023 compared to 2022. So I think that is notable. So the world has been concerned about the possibility of a war in the Taiwan Strait.
So where do you think those worries come from? Because as you mentioned, right, the story about Taiwan, the democracy, semiconductors, I mean, this story, Taiwan's democracy has been around for about, a few decades, and semiconductor story as well. So now it sounds like the real factor is the growing tensions across the Taiwan Strait. Do you think those worries are legitimate?
There's no doubt that China has increased its military capabilities. And we know that the head of the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States, Bill Burns, has said that Xi Jinping instructed the PLA to have the capabilities to seize and control Taiwan by 2027. So I think the concern is warranted. That said, I don't think that there is evidence that an attack on Taiwan is either imminent or inevitable. And so it is important for the entire world, including Taiwan, to take more measures to bolster defense capabilities so that war does not happen. So I believe that the attention is warranted, but I don't think that the fear and alarm is warranted. And I would also say that there is evidence in the past month or so that senior U.S. officials have been calling attention to that the corruption in the PLA and Xi Jinping's focus on the economy, they believe, has made it even less likely that any attack will take place in the near future. Now, that doesn't mean beyond this year, the next year, or perhaps even beyond 2027, that we shouldn't be concerned. So everyone should take this seriously, because if we don't, then perhaps war becomes more likely. But no, it is neither imminent nor inevitable.
Well, that's a really good way to frame it. And so, while the world's attention has been on Taiwan versus China, sort of the cross-strait tensions, and there's a reason why, that's sort of taken and borrowed domestically to frame the election as well as war and peace. But what, in your view, is the missing story of Taiwan? Whether it's just generally about the elections or, generally speaking, how should the world learn about Taiwan?
Well, first, I'd like to point out that there is much more coverage in the international media, especially, of course, in the United States in the last few years. This is not only due to increased interest, but also due to the fact that many really top-notch reporters who left China are now based in Taiwan, and they're writing about Taiwan. Whereas years ago, we used to have reporters who would just come to Taiwan for the elections or come for a week to do some reporting. And there's been many in-depth stories about Taiwan in recent years. For example, its indigenous communities, skepticism in Taiwan about the United States, whether America would come to defend Taiwan, Taiwan's immigration policies and labor laws, obviously, semiconductor industry, challenges faced by Taiwan's youth, the identity issue. There's just been so many stories. And around the elections, there's been some good stories about PRC interference in Taiwan and what Taiwan is doing to combat the particularly information narrative that and disinformation that has been coming from China. So I first want to highlight that there's really been a lot of coverage of Taiwan. I think perhaps one issue, from my perspective, that hasn't received sufficient attention is the relationship between the civilians and the military. And that has a historical background, of course, in Taiwan, because the KMT really used to be a party military and then was transformed to a national military. But there's a lot of hangover because most of the people in the senior positions in the military had come from the mainland. They were part of the KMT, and that has begun to change. But there's still a lot of, I think, hangover of the historical role of military.
Did you mean sort of, the military, especially the leadership, used to be dominated by those with mainlander backgrounds, and how that's affected sort of the military's view of China? Or can you elaborate a little bit more?
Well, from my perspective, Taiwan has a military that is not really well integrated with the senior
society,
civilian leadership, or the society. And so in the United States, for example, we have the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which is all manned by civilians, and they work in the Defense Department. And so there really is civil military integration and civilian control, and shaping of capabilities and decisions that it really doesn't exist from my perspective in Taiwan. And I think that this is something that Taiwan needs to work on.
That's fascinating. Would you say that is certainly affecting how much reforms can be carried out right now? As we see that there's a lot of sort of advocacy around reforming the military, etc., efficiency, etc. But it sounds like it's not as easy, even from president's level, to trickle down those reforms.
Yes, well, my view is that there first and foremost needs to be institutional reforms, and we haven't seen enough of that. But you mentioned society, and so I want to add that there's been some interesting developments in Taiwan to build some civil defense capabilities from the bottom up through NGOs. But they are not well integrated with the military, whereas if you look at what has been developed in countries like Finland or Sweden or in the Baltic states, what you have is the military coming and training civilians on the weekend and teaching them how they can defend their communities and their neighborhoods in the event of an attack. And I think what you have in Taiwan is still fairly stovepiped developments where the military is making its own advances in terms of its capabilities to defend Taiwan. And then you have these separate NGO-run things like Forward Defense and the Kuma Academy that are trying to do very good work with average people. But it's my understanding that these two are not really integrated.
Well, excellent point. Take note, I hope international reporters or Taiwanese reporters will start dig deeper into this story. It's a really good tip. Now, I want to ask you, as a longtime observer of Taiwan, and you had mentioned there's a surge of interest in Taiwan internationally, as well as in Washington, D.C. And how do you feel about the quality of the analysis and commentaries?
Well, first, Wenchi, I do think that this surge of interest in Taiwan is welcome and necessary. Most of the focus, though, has been on Taiwan's defense needs. And again, that is extremely important. It's essential. But it should be the start, but not the end of American attention to Taiwan. As I have argued, and others have, of course, and we make this point, Richard Bush and Ryan Hass and I in our book, that China's gray zone threats are quite pernicious and dangerous for Taiwan. And this includes cyber, disinformation, propaganda. All of these require increased attention and creative strategies to counter. And at times, I think some Americans, including former senior officials, have made recommendations that have been harmful to Taiwan. There was one example where a former senior official said that the United States should have a plan to destroy Taiwan's chip fabs in the event of a PRC attack. And I think that recommendation was both unnecessary and harmful to Taiwan's interests. So I hope that the conversation about Taiwan's security is defined as more than just helping to defend Taiwan, which, again, essential, but we think more about Taiwan's security in a broader way and help Taiwan to counter other threats, especially the psychological and cognitive warfare that the PRC is using against Taiwan. Because ultimately, my view is that China doesn't want to fight a war. It really wants to convince the people of Taiwan that they shouldn't have confidence in their government or in the United States, and that they really don't have a bright future unless they become part of China. And ultimately, that is, I believe, quite dangerous. And I think it requires the United States to think more about how we can reassure the people of Taiwan and how we can make the people of Taiwan more aware of the United States' commitments to Taiwan's security. And I don't mean defense commitments, but really how important Taiwan's democracy is to the United States.
Yeah, then again, I think, certain points of view about Taiwan tend to focus on the military side of defense. And we saw that, I think over the weekend, there's a New York Times article that also quoted a think tank expert, saying sort of, we need Taiwan because we need it to hold out. So we, meaning the US, can get to it, have enough time. I don't really think personally that's really what she meant ultimately about, Taiwan's importance. But when it's taken out of context like that, it does raise questions in Taiwan, sort of, what is the U.S. motives? And so I think people like you and Ryan and Richard and many others who advocate, for a more sort of complete story about Taiwan, I think is really important. Now, in Taiwan, the media's attention has shifted to the legislative yuan election, which is really important as well, because the DPP is now a ruling party, but there's going to be a coalition of opposition. And so how might this shake out for the next 4 years of Lai Ching-te's administration?
Well, of course, this is a big change in Taiwan's politics. I believe it's been about 20 years since Taiwan had a
led government.
Yeah, I'll say that again. I believe it's been about 20 years since Taiwan has had a legislature that was not dominated by a single party. And therefore, this is a challenge for the incoming president, Lai Ching-te. He will not have the luxury, as Tsai Ing-wen had. It was a great advantage to her to have an LY dominated by the DPP with a fairly strong majority for 8 years. And divided government, of course, is not new to Taiwan and not new to the DPP, because when Chen Shui-bian was president, the LY, of course, was in control of the KMT. The question going forward, you mentioned that there might be a coalition of the opposition in the LY. My guess is that there won't be a solid coalition between the KMT and the TPP. Historically, of course, in the legislative yuan, there have been negotiations over things on an issue-by-issue basis. I doubt that that will really change going forward. I think it's in Ko-Wen-je's interest to have his party work sometimes with the KMT and perhaps on some issues with the DPP, potentially playing kingmaker and growing the importance and influence of his party. So it may start out as a cooperation between the KMT and TPP, but my guess is that going forward, it will depend on the specific issues that are being discussed. From the U.S. point of view, the lack of a DPP majority in the legislative yuan is a bit concerning because the United States wants to see continued budgets passed that have increases in defense spending, and we have seen that in Tsai Ing-wen's period in office, where I believe virtually every year she has passed an increase in defense spending, certainly in her second term. And then, of course, there's the likelihood of special budgets that need to be passed to purchase expensive weapons platforms. And so I think that there is some concern in the United States that maybe it will be difficult to sustain the resources that have been devoted to Taiwan's defense.
KMT on the campaign trail actually also advocated, or at least, Hou You-yi said he would like to see defense budget increase as well. So do you think the KMT will continue that kind of position into the LY? Even now, they are likely to be in the leadership position in LY.
Well, I think that's a very important question, Wen-chi, and I don't think we know. There are different views in the KMT. There are some people who have been strongly supportive of devoting more resources to defense. There are others, I think, who have been less so, who really wanted to focus on, if the KMT had been elected into office, on improving relations with China and restoring the dialogue channels and some of the cooperative channels with China. So that, of course, did not happen. And so the question is, what does the KMT try to do going forward? It begins, of course, with who will be the chair and who will be making decisions, what will be the influence of the old guard, including Ma Ying-jeou. These are existential questions for the KMT. And I think there is a possibility going forward that the KMT can be a very strong party. And Taiwan as a democracy, I believe, needs to have a strong opposition. But it will have to make some changes if it is going to play that role.
Well, now back to cross-strait relations. Should we worry about anything?
Well, we absolutely should worry about cross-strait relations. It's my view that the absence of cross-strait official communication channels has led to misunderstanding and misperceptions and could lead to miscalculation. I'm also very much in favor of more cross-strait exchanges, especially between the people that live on both sides of the strait. I think that people in China need to get a better understanding
So
of Taiwan.
on that, can I just, interrupt? Sorry about this, but which side is more responsible from your point of view for not having the exchanges or for not being able to have more communication?
Well, I think there shouldn't be any doubt about that at all. In my view, it's the it's the China side. It's the PRC. Because Tsai Ing-wen for the last 8 years has said that she would be willing to have dialogue with Beijing. And of course, Lai Ching-te has said the same. At the beginning of Tsai Ing-wen's period in office, right after she was elected in 2016, she went, I would say, more than halfway to provide reassurances to Beijing. She said not only she would follow the ROC constitutional order, the act governing relations across the Taiwan Strait, but also referred to the meetings and understandings that had been reached in 1992 without, of course, endorsing the 1992 consensus. Mm-hmm. But in my view, and as we write in our book, China set the bar deliberately high, too high, for Tsai Ing-wen to be able to get over it, to be able to convince China that she was a good partner and that it was in Beijing's interest to restore dialogue across the strait. Mm-hmm. So I think Beijing just never really intended to deal with her, unless, of course, she embraced the 1992 consensus, which they knew she would not. So really the question is today for Lai Ching-te, has Beijing changed that strategy? Is it going to similarly set the bar so high that he can never meet any of their demands? Or will they lower it because now they understand that it is not necessarily in their interest to have no communications with Taiwan?
Well, it's also an election year in Washington, D.C., and we're likely to see stronger rhetoric about China on the campaign trail. We know a congressional delegation is also on its way to Taipei, led by Representative Mike Gallagher. So how will D.C. play a role in this delicate trilateral relations?
So first, I think that the delegation that is on the way to Taiwan is going to include some of the co-chairs of the U.S.-Taiwan caucus, if I'm not mistaken. I believe Representative Gallagher is going to visit Taiwan on a later trip. So I don't think they'll be there at the same time. But of course, there will be lots of...
There's going to be a few, yes. Right.
Yes, and when it comes to the inauguration, there'll be even more. Mm-hmm. Washington will work to preserve the cross-strait status quo. It will encourage Beijing to be open to dialogue with the democratically elected government in Taipei, and it will suggest that Beijing judge President-elect Lai by his future words and deeds as president, not by his past. And I think that the U.S. will encourage Lai to continue Tsai Ing-wen's cross-strait policy, which, of course, he has pledged to do. And that includes being prudent, very deliberate, avoiding measures that could incite cross-strait tensions. And then finally, of course, Washington will continue to strengthen relations with Taiwan. And that means not only in the defense area, but also strengthening our bilateral economic relationship. Which at least I hope to see this year, the finalization of the double tax agreement, mm-hmm. as well as the 21st century U.S.-Taiwan trade initiative.
Well, it sounds like there's going to be continuing stories and hopefully more exchanges between U.S. and Taiwan. But we also, hope for some more peaceful and, stability across Taiwan Strait as well between Beijing and Taipei. So, well, thank you, Bonnie, so much always for your valuable insights. And for those in Taiwan, Bubu Weiying is now available in all bookstores and can be ordered online as well. Well, thank you, Bonnie.
Thanks so much for having me, Wenchi.